right, thank you all for being here. I'm really delighted to introduce not one, but two of my co-authors to you today to present work that is at once deeply engaged with and relevant in South Asia, but also relevant in present day United States. This is not actually an easy thing to pull off. Adnan Naseemullah is here. He is currently a reader in international politics at King's College London. I'll also add that he is a Quaker in war studies, for those who are thinking about such things. He will shortly be moving to Oxford University, I think I'm allowed to okay, in a full professor position, which is wonderful news. He is the author of numerous articles and 3 books on South Asian politics, one of which, of course, he will present today. Pradeep Chhibber is the Indo-American community chair in India Studies at UC Berkeley. He is the author of more books and articles than I can count, and it was, as his former advisee, dissertation advisee, it was at one time one of my jobs to know all of them. This is all public information and things you can look up on the internet, but I wanted to share something about both Pradeep and Dan. That is a bit more personal, but also, I think, important to understanding this project. So this is a book about populism. It's also about commonalities between India and Pakistan, 2 countries that are almost exclusively associated with divergence. The authors' families, in some ways, mirror this commonality despite divergence. So Dan's family was originally from India, though Dan grew up in Pakistan and was born in London. And Pradeep's family was originally from Pakistan, but he grew up in India. I think it's beautiful that together they've written a book that helps us understand populist movements in both countries, as well as those elsewhere in Latin America. So let us give us a warm welcome to Pradeep.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Susan, for the introduction, and thank you for not embarrassing me more than, because you could have said lots of things. I'm sure you have more information about me than most humans need to know. So thank you all for coming. And I just want to say that this is a difficult project to present for multiple reasons. First, it's a project about populism, about which everybody has an opinion, so it's very hard to talk about it. Number 2, it is a project that is deeply embedded in the histories of South Asia, and the question is how much do we do, and we won't do much of it today, right? And third, it's a difficult project to present because the idea of populism itself is very contentious. So I think it's not easy to do, so we will try and do what we can. And I'm going to start by making a statement we came up with today, which we'll show here, which is that we normally assume, when we think of populism, we think of populism as doing bad things, right? So if you read the literature today, it is almost a pejorative term. Populism is bad. In fact, there are lots of books, populism. The moment you have populism, all kinds of bad things happen. There's democratic decline, there's, pick your, praise, and that's what's going on. Dan and I have a slightly different take. Before I put the slide up, because one problem with slides is I am a victim to them. And some points when I'm talking, I realize maybe that was a mistake. But in any case, here both of us believe that at the heart of it, democracy is about political equality. And democracy is a way of offering political equality. Populism, we argue, and I want you to hear this out for a moment, is actually a part and parcel of democracy. They are both intertwined with each other in much more fundamental ways than we understand. Why? Because populism is normally understood, and we'll talk about this in a moment, as a movement that represents the people against a corrupt elite. And any time you have inequality in a democracy, and we are only going to talk of democracies here. Anytime you have inequality in a democracy, the way that inequality is often expressed is by saying, there are the people out there, and these people's views are not being represented by an elite. And in fact, we argue in this book, I think not as convincingly as we do in this talk perhaps, is that populism is something that goes hand in hand with democracy. And actually, there's populists to be found in democracy across the globe at all times. And when we get to the US case, populism has been a part of the US at least nominally since the 1870s. It's not something new in the US. There are lots of examples of populist politics in the United States as well. The countries we are focusing on South Asia, according to the VDEM index, right? The largest number of populist parties exist in South Asia. And here's a continent that is normally understood in terms of ethnic politics. And if it's ethnic politics, then why are we seeing populist parties, right? And in fact, Dan and I begin the book by arguing that the most significant changes of party politics in South Asia have actually happened through populists rather than not through populists. In other words, populists drive political change. And our argument in some sense is, put it very simply, is that populism and democracy are intertwined. You find democracy, and as long as democracy carries a promise of political equality and doesn't deliver on it, you will find populists. The question we should not be asking is populists exists, but the question we should be asking is, when do populists become really powerful players? Because that's the question I think we should be asking, and that's the question we're trying to answer in this book. Okay, so in a nutshell, so what is our argument? We argue that populism, which is normally understood, and we pick this classic definition of populism rather than a Google definition, if you will, or a dictionary definition, if you will, rather than defining it on our own terms. The distinction between elites and masses, there are the pure masses and there are the corrupt elite. And we said this is an essential characteristic of democracy. There is procedural inequality. In other words, we're not talking of economic inequalities or social inequality. There is a state, there is a government. People feel that somehow that the state actually is only representing the interests of the connected, the well-connected, and is biased against the normal people. And the normal people actually are not being treated equally by the state. Those who don't have influence, those who don't have wealth, are being left out by the democratic state. That to us lies at the heart of the populist enterprise. And I think we can see a lot of that in many parts of the world. And this, we think, this feeling of procedural inequality or political inequality presents itself as a crisis of representation. And of course, the wider the crisis is, the more a populist can mobilize support. But we'll talk about that in a moment, okay? Now, when you think of populism, right, there are lots of populists across the world. And in fact, in South Asia, there are so many populists, I cannot tell you, just the list is really, really long. But only some of them manage to consolidate power. Not all of them manage to consolidate power, right? Many populists come, nobody really cares about them. And you can think of the United States as well. There are plenty of people echoing populist messages, right? Take a few names, Bernie Sanders for one, to Pat Buchanan on the other hand, all echoing the masses against the people, the pure people against them. They don't manage to win elections. They don't manage to consolidate power, right? So the question is, why is it that despite this prevalence of populism, do some elites manage to consolidate power? Our argument, therefore, is that populism, right, as it we normally express it now, when I think I should be looking at the slides, right, that what populists managed to do, what populists who have managed to win elections, what they managed to do really, really well is to make promises to restore a moral order. And they make promises to restore a moral order saying we will treat everybody equally. What is the promise that the state made? What is the promise that the democratic state made? The promise that the democratic state made was everybody will be treated equally. We believe, the populists, will ensure that's what happens. That's the moral promise they make. They say we will eliminate sources of political inequality and return power to the people. That is the promise of most populists, right? And these stories and promises resonate with the unrepresented people across multiple cleavages. And since Scott is here, I have to say this, therefore it transforms the party system, right? And it leads to changes in party systems forever. Okay. All right. So, okay. Our strategy is bada bing, bada bang.
Thanks,
So,
yes.
so here's the bing now. All right. As soon as I figure this fancy thing out. Okay, so there have been many, many, many arguments about the definition of populism, and largely it's because, very honestly, people talk about populism from the cases that they're interested in, which leads to a lot of disagreements. The way we approach this, after a lot of hand-wringing, is to just Google it. It turned out, actually, it was the best definition ever. Thank you, Uncle Google. A political approach that strives to appeal to the ordinary people who feel like their concerns are disregarded by established elite groups. And of course, this actually echoes sort of established definitions in the academic literature. Muda writing about populism and comparative perspective, Hazen writing about sort of American politics. Essentially, still the same thing about people versus the elite, mobilizing one against the other. We start our framework by talking about crises of representation. They're deeply associated with political inequality. Now, in an ideal democracy, which does not exist anywhere in the world, in an ideal democracy, political inequality should not exist because everyone is represented and everyone is then treated equally by the state. In the real world, though, political parties are self-interested organizations, and many of those organizations are focused on their own, specific parochial objectives rather than this sort of ideal of representation. They often fail in their core function as representatives, both individually and collectively, leading to things like cartel parties and things, thus creating the sort of conditions for political inequality. As a result, and this is the crisis of representation that we see as the background condition for populists to arise, there are groups of citizens who are meaningfully unrepresented in the political system. Now, populist leaders then, to be effective, they need to make appeals to the unrepresented in the polity. They do so by appealing to a restoration or a restitution of what we call the moral contract. That democracy, the democratic system, should provide equality before the state as an ideal. What they're really doing is telling stories about the brokenness of the system, the brokenness of this moral contract, and they make promises about the restoration of that moral contract, the restitution of this sort of moral order that's really deeply held in democracies that can resonate across electoral cleavages. Now, just 2 words on cleavage theory. There are 2 political scientists called Seymour Martin Lipset and Stein Roken, basically saying that the polity is divided by cleavages, or sort of divisions, social divisions that people tend not to cross in their electoral behavior. And that separates the polity into different groups of voters that are identified by particular characteristics. The environmentally conscious, for example, right? And if you just are mobilizing people within your cleavage, you're just mobilizing the people who would normally vote for you, that's not particularly impactful. But if you're able to actually get support from across cleavages, then that's how you get sort of transformations or realignments in the party system. Ultimately, we argue that in most, if not, well, actually most cases, populists are politicians. Their object is to win elections. So as a result, populism is ultimately about political, economic, electoral strategy rather than anything else.
Now, the sort of heart of the book is actually a typology, which is about how resonant and how broad the populism actually is. So we start with what we call the quotidian populist politics, which is where the crisis of representation is relatively narrow. There's some people who are represented and other people who are represented. But, so representation is a reality for some people, but some groups are unrepresented. However, these quotidian populists appeal only to a partisan base within normally accepted electoral cleavages, which polarizes the party system, but it doesn't actually fundamentally change the nature of party competition. So a good example here would be someone like Ted Cruz. Ted Cruz sounds like a populist all the time, but the people who vote for Ted Cruz are very, very much within the sort of cleavages of the American party system, Republican voters. Now, on the other side of the spectrum, and this is more like the populists of your imagination, like the Juan Perons of the world, right? In this situation, the crisis of representation is incredibly broad. Only a small sliver of the electorate are actually being represented by the system. In this case, populists can form completely new political parties and appeal across multiple cleavages to many, many different groups, completely transforming the party system, right? And then the third group is actually what we argue is most of the populist leaders that we pay attention to, the ones that are impactful in contemporary politics, are what we call additive populists in additive populist politics. Here, the crisis of representation is narrower. Representation is a reality, but some groups are unrepresented. But these additive populists appeal to an extant partisan base and to particular voters across usually one cleavage, realigning the party system. So if you think about the 2016 Trump election, it was the Republican base plus white working class voters in the upper Midwest. In the UK, this was the Brexit vote. It was the normal conservative voters plus the so-called red wall, voting for taking back control. So that's generally the sort of typology at the center of the thing, which is to think about not just what populism is, but when is it impactful? And how is it impactful in terms of its resonance? And now I'm going to turn it over back.
Okay. Alrighty, so now comes the fun part, right? For me, and the boring part. For maybe some of you, because you may not know much about South Asia. So let me just take a brief thing and say a couple of things before we start. First, I don't know about you, there are many students sitting here. When you think of a populist, right, what do you normally imagine? You normally imagine some, normally they're men, in the South Asian, there are some, women as well, riding in on a white horse and someone saying, I am the leader, follow me, right? That rarely happens. Most populists in the world are actually politicians who've been playing the game for a long time, and suddenly they change themselves and start making populist appeals. And there are plenty of examples of this in Latin America. There are plenty of examples of this in South Asia. I can also think of a couple of, these people riding in on horses, but those are few and far between, but they certainly exist. So most of these politicians, people are, they're politicians, right? So what they're doing is they've figured out a way to maybe, okay, what is a politician trying to do? Win an election. They go, okay, now I've got this group. I am part of this group. This group belongs to me. What am I going to do to get more votes? What is the strategy that I'm going to use to be able to mobilize more voters? And that's when, in some sense, is what driving these populists, okay? That's the logic. And what they're doing is they're looking around and saying, okay, what I realize is that there are two parties, let's say party A and party B, just thinking heuristically. I am from party B, and my party is stuck at, as in the Indian case, at 20%. It doesn't get any more votes than 20%. How do I get to 30% and become a player or become a major party? I figure out maybe there's party A, and party A is no longer representing some people, because there is some group in party A that is not happy with what party A is doing. I tailor my message without losing my supporters in party B and mobilize people from party A. That's what the game I'm going to be playing. That's in a nutshell the logic, okay? Now, South Asia is an interesting case to study populism, which is why the book really began. Is that mostly the assumption of South Asia, and especially India, is what? It's a society driven by caste, religion, language, ethnicity. You know a person's caste, you know their ethnicity, you know the language, you know the religion, you can predict who they're going to vote for. You don't need to know anything else. But if that were true, this is a simple fact. We would not see so much party system change being led by populists. So in other words, if the first logic was right, you would have lots of parties representing their groups, yes or no? If you believe ethnic voting matters, or religion matters, and caste matters, and language matters, you should have parties representing those groups, fair enough? But the major changes that have happened is some person comes in and just completely changes the system, right? And that is a fact. So you cannot have both a party system rooted in social divisions and say that's the only source of social change. The major source of social party system change in India and Pakistan have been populists. And this is pretty well established. So the question is, why? So what happened with this project? Well, Dan and I, we've been, during COVID days, we were taking a walk, one of those interminable walks we take. And in the walk, we suddenly realized that both India and Pakistan had seen an interesting pattern. In the 1970s, both saw left populists. In the 2010s, both saw right populists. Now that's surprising because India is on paper a democracy. Pakistan is on, paper has been a democracy, is a military establishment, is a democracy, is a little bit unclear what it is sometimes, right? And if you look at these two countries, you would say, why are we even comparing them? One is so large, one is so small, but there are interesting reasons why. And we said, but wait a minute, that sounds odd. What's going on here? We started working on it and we realized there's actually a lot more commonality in the history of those countries. And for those of you who care to read this, it was really refreshing and scary for us to write the first few chapters because at least through the mid-70s, the country's policies look identical. And in fact, if you read the policies they're adopting, they're pretty much adopting similar policies, except one is a democracy, having elections, the other is a dictatorship. But on the ground, the economic policies they're adopting look virtually identical. It's kind of interesting to watch. So what do we find out? So what we find out is that in the 1950s and 60s, and I'm going to talk after this slide, I'm going to speak briefly about something which is deeply South Asia specific. So for those of you who are not interested in South Asia, can take a short nap and we'll get back to it. In the 1950s and 60s, before the rise of the left populists, our argument is very simple. When India and Pakistan became independent in 1947, forget the regime for a moment, they both have states, and our argument is very simple, that the states actually don't reach very deep into society with some differences. Both states are characterized by deep social inequalities, and both states have systems in which the big agriculturalists or landlords with large differences between India and Pakistan. On that score, industrialists, bureaucrats are actually running the system. And at the local level, essentially the state is absent. And both India and Pakistan try efforts at rural transformation, right? Similar efforts at rural transformation, both those efforts collapse. And in fact, the period from the 1950s to the 1960s in both countries is a period in which politics is really an elite level game that is being played among a certain segment of the elite, electoral politics or non-electoral politics, as in the case of Pakistan. That's what's going on. As a result, what happens is Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, who is an establishment politician, who was a foreign minister with the military government, and Indira Gandhi, who is, the daughter of, Jawaharlal Nehru, who was India's prime minister, was a Congress president, suddenly take a sharp populist turn. And they both take a left populist turn, saying, what are we going to do? Indira Gandhi's famous line is, and Bhutto's line is identical, which is, we are going to look after the poor people. All these guys are focused on this. This sounds very familiar to you. All the other parties, all the other people, they're only interested in politics. I am interested in the people. And I am going to look after the people. I'm going to do things for the people. So that's what Indira Gandhi says. I'm going to remove poverty. Bhutto says, I'm going to give everybody, bread, clothes, and houses. Right? That's what I'm going to do. That's the strategy we're going to use. As a result, what happens? They mobilize, and both Bhutto and Indira Gandhi completely change India's party system. So once Indira Gandhi comes to power, there's a Congress party. She's also running a Congress party, but the Congress party no longer looks the same. And so they lead to a much deeper transformation. And now for those of you who don't want to, follow what happens. Oh, sorry, I need to go back. Now, those of you who are not interested in South Asia can hold off and go to sleep for a moment. And I'm going to say something somewhat tricky for the South Asian context. So what happens is they both transform the party system. So on paper, India is run by a Congress party until 1967. India is run by a Congress party from 1971 onwards. The name is the party is virtually identical. But the party is representing very, very different things. So what Indira Gandhi does, and I think Bhutto does something very similar, is they create party politics. And in the Indian case especially, what they do, both of them, and I think this is really important for us to understand what happens in India and Pakistan today, is prior, and I'm going to say this, and I don't know if this next slide says this, so prior to the 1950s and 60s, what do you have? You have the state at the top and you have people down below, and in the middle is kind of, these elites running the show, and most people at the bottom are only marginally engaged with politics, right? So at the bottom level, there's a lot of tension between the rich people and the poor people. They're expressed in all kinds of ways, but there is tension among the rich and the poor. What do Indira Gandhi and Zulfikar Ali Bhutto do? They say, don't worry, we will fix that. How will we fix it? We are going to introduce the state. We are going to introduce the state as a solution to the problem of political inequality. Right? Now, in principle, that is not a bad idea, right? Which is somebody has to address this political inequality. I will reform the government, and the government will now will look after this political inequality. But what you do as a result, and this becomes an important story, is they actually expand the role of the state significantly. So all of a sudden, the state from being not present in most places is now present in literally everything. Okay? Is everybody good with that? So keep that in the back of your head. Okay? And there are interesting implications to those who want to study South Asia. And if you want, let me just say it to you, because I've been itching to say this, and you will ignore it, is that with the introduction of the state, and I can answer this in Q&A as well, it forecloses the possibility of class politics and changes class politics in India into caste politics. And I can talk about how that's happened, and we say that explicitly in a book. In other words, the introduction of the state as a solution to the problem of social and political economic inequality, instead of removing the inequality, actually introduces ethnic inequalities as a means of raises ethnic inequalities to the fore, while foreclosing the possibility of class-based mobilization. And we can talk about that at some length if you want, okay? So then populists come to power. Now, of course, it's very easy to say, as it is for a populist anywhere in the world, put me in charge and I'll take care of things, right? Doesn't happen, right? Both Indira Gandhi and Bhutto come to power. And for those of you who may care to know, you should see, and if you think about administrative reform is easy, you should see an episode on Yes, Minister, I think episode 4, there's a British BBC series where the minister comes to power and says they want to introduce administrative reform and change the system, and nothing, of course, ever happens. So Indira Gandhi comes, and this is a country of almost 1 billion people, I think less than 800 or 900 million people, and she's going to reform the system, and all of a sudden, India will move from a system of capitalism and power dominance to, equality for all. Doesn't happen. As a result, what happens is, they face challenges. She's faced challenges from people who question her role. She faces challenges from within the party. Bhutto faces similar challenges. He can't govern, both from existing power structures. As a result, they both end up pursuing authoritarian politics. So both Indira Gandhi and Bhutto start pursuing authoritarian politics. India has its first dictatorship between 75 and 77 under Indira Gandhi because this populist project is collapsing. But both in India and Pakistan, what have you done? You've introduced a state now as a player, number one. Number two, this state is not controlled by one person, but the state itself, because of the nature of the political economy of both places, is extremely fragmented. Because the state is extremely fragmented, the state becomes corrupt, right? Which is not unusual. But now into this corrupt state, what do? You start introducing economic reforms, okay? You have a large state, you actually can't keep supporting the state because you're running out of money. You run out of money, you start introducing economic reforms as a way to, improve your balance sheet in both cases. You introduce economic reforms, liberalization comes. Great idea. But now on the one hand, you have market reforms, and on the other hand, you have a government that's present everywhere. What does that lead to? Crony capitalism, right? And the state being present everywhere and state bureaucrats making money left, right, and center, right? At some, without a doubt, in fact, how many of you are interested in crypto and the stock market and so on and so forth? Come on. Anybody want to make money? It's Notre Dame. Nobody here makes money. We only think of stocks, right? For those of you who care to know, it's actually the far better investment of your life to become an Indian politician. You're laughing at me. Indian politicians, according to the reported income in this one southern Indian state for which you guys have data, they increase their assets by 1,000%, reported assets by 1,000% in 5 years. So if you think, what crypto? I mean, that's not real money, right? This is real money, okay? So in other words, bad jokes aside, what happens is you create a system in which you have lots of economic reform, you have lots of money coming in, but that money is actually being subject to political whims and fancies. That creates an opportunity for right-wing populists in both countries. So both in India and Pakistan, the right wing comes about and says, put me in charge, I will reform the state. I will take care of this reformation. I will reform the state and everything will be better for you. Of course, that's the message Modi uses to come to power. Once he comes to power, him and Imran Khan both actually can't deliver. Imran Khan for different reasons, Modi for different reasons, but Modi can't deliver on his promises. As a result, in Modi's case, Imran Khan didn't get a chance to do this, but in Modi's case, you turn very quickly from populist politics to right-wing politics, because that's the only way you can actually continue to mobilize support. But a bang. Okay, so no.
Okay, yes, let's
We
skip
need to
Pakistan. We can return to Pakistan if you're interested. But this is when we blast it open and talk more about comparative cases. So we have two chapters here. One, I'm going to talk at slightly greater length, but a previous chapter looks at the politics of populism in Europe and in Latin America. And here, it's really, really fashioned by the nature of the structures of representation. One of the things that we learned a lot from Keough, actually, but also in general, is that in Latin America, you have relatively brittle party systems, lots of crisis of representation, which actually then leads to a preponderance of reordering populist politics, in which the system as a whole falls apart and there's a rise of a populist leader, whether it's Hugo Chavez, whether it's AMLO. Bolsonaro is interesting because Bolsonaro is actually after the sort of PT and the sort of earlier phase of sort of workers-based politics. So it's much more additive. It's bringing together the right, but not actually sort of capturing left-wing voters. But also Nayib Bukele. This idea is that from our understanding, what Latin America has is it's more subject to this reordering thing because the crisis of representation is so large and that parties themselves are somewhat brittle. In Europe, however, we have deeply, deeply institutionalized party systems, especially since basically World War II. And so as a result, what it tends to do is yield a lot of quotidian populist politics and some additive politics. politics. And some of the quotidian populist politics involves new parties. So like, for example, Giorgia Meloni in Italy just basically consolidates the right that had been fragmented between Lega and the Five Stars, and basically use the old Christian right cleavage to sort of consolidate power. Similarly, you might get sort of exchanges between the old Spanish socialists and Podemos, but it's the same basic cleavage where there's very little crossing. There are, however, some additive populist politics, like Boris Johnson, as I mentioned before. Erdogan, Orban, some of these other cases are using a partisan base, but then expanding it and then consolidating power in the case of both Orban and Erdogan. We haven't talked so much about the consequences, but we're happy to talk about it in Q&A, basically thinking about very different types of consequences based on our three types. But what I really wanted to do was to talk more about how different types of populism in the United States conform to different modes or different types of populism in our framework. So, I mean, the quintessential, archetypical, OG populists were the People's Party in the 1890s, which was an alliance of farmers and workers against oligarchic trusts, the railroads, especially, that were in bed with both the Democratic and the Republican Party.
But you can do something really cool.
Yes.
We can talk about this, right?
Yes, it's the betrayal of George Washington. And if you've got like 5 minutes, I would highly recommend, well, not more than 5 minutes, but read the party constitution of the People's Party. It's amazing. But one of the things that we noticed actually was the People's Party was devastatingly successful in states in which both the Republicans and the Democrats were not successfully representing. So Kansas was sort of the hotbed of the People's Party, whereas it was actually a lot less effective in Nebraska and Iowa, because those are places in which actually the Republican Party was actually responding to the needs of the people. There is additive populist politics that's actually quite dramatic in nature in terms of FDR and the New Deal. The Democrats used to be in this, in these this was essentially the Democratic Party, the Deep South plus, Massachusetts and Rhode Island. But then between 1928 and 1932, you have expansion throughout the country, partly because what FDR is able to do is to reach voters outside of the normal sort of electoral base of the Democratic Party to restore the American dream, the nature of the New Deal. What we've seen throughout is all types of quotidian populisms of the right and of the left. You have Pat Buchanan and Ted Cruz, you have Jesse Jackson and Bernie Sanders. Whatever your sympathies, those are people who are essentially energizing the base, re-energizing, right? They're very exciting, but what they're not doing is actually offering something that can reach beyond a particular cleavage. Which then gets us to Trump and MAGA, additive populism of the right, partly because what Trump is doing is transforming the Republican Party itself in such a way that can actually lead to reaching beyond particular cleavages. I'm sure that all of us have a lot to say about Donald Trump. Trajectory of 2020 is not that surprising in our framework, because when populists come into power, the essence of the populist vision kind of withers on the vine, and you have competing interests between different parts of the coalition, which leads to collapse. And also you energize the opposition and other institutions like courts, not so much now, but once upon a time we're very, very active in stopping that, and that led to Joe Biden being elected. The one thing that we can say about 2024, which in some senses is a really simple election, because it's sort of the anti-incumbency wave throughout Western Europe, which included the UK, which went from a conservative government to a Labour government, was still, from our framework, Biden was not very effective in figuring out how to address the broken moral contract. That the policies themselves did not then translate into a salience of greater political equality. And so we'll talk more about this in the Q&A, which is more of the sort of stable, what we think is the sort of testable implications of these categories in terms of outcomes. But also, in the end, it may actually just be the price of eggs. So anyway, we're happy to take questions on any of that. And yeah, we'll look forward to your questions.
Happy to throw out questions, but I do want to sort of see from the room if anybody has anything that they would like.
Yes, name and question.
My name is Nikhil. I'm teaching the history department here. My question is about South Asia, so
yeah,
maybe someone can take a nap again. It's about you said that in the 1970s with Bhutto and with Indira Gandhi, that there is an entry of a new sort of the state into South Asian society. I'm wondering, in your book, what kinds of evidence you offer of this being a sort of dramatically different phase? Because as you point out, in the 1950s, of course, there is like centralized planning happening in both Pakistan under a military dictatorship under Ayub and in India under Nehru. And I think that both the supporters of those governments and their critics would argue that the government is very much present, like in the countryside, right? Like the supporters would say, we're trying to conduct land reforms. Critics would say that there's too much intervention going on, like the Swatantra Party would say. So aside from, of course, like a harder leftward turn that Bhutto and Indira Gandhi undertake, what is the kind of, I mean, that seems like a sort of policy orientation rather than a sort of, to me, a question of like deeper intervention to society. So, I mean, I'm assuming that in your book you explored this. I just want to know what are the sort of measures by which you assess that?
Okay, so I'll give you the Indian and Pakistani cases both. I think both, okay, so first, the 1950s and 60s, in both cases, rural development was marked by something called community development. And we both know that community development was mostly, and is widely acknowledged now, was just a farce. It did not work. India introduced land reforms, Pakistan did not introduce land reforms, so that's one big difference. But in India, still, as is well documented, rural landlords and upper castes control the place, right? So even though the state was present, the state wasn't really present in the villages. That's the first thing, right? Once the land reforms were done, the state backed out. Nehru, for his practical political reasons, said local elites can run the show, vote banks were well established, that's the game. Now think of the changes that happened starting in the 1950s, starting in the 1960s. And I'll give you a simple example. There's a green revolution. All of a sudden you have farmers. Farmers need money. They can't get money. Where are they going to get money from? Banks won't lend it to them. So what does the Indian government do and the Pakistanis do? Exactly, by the way, this is amazing, the parallels. What do? You take over the banking system and you start introducing agricultural credit societies. What you start doing, if you watch both cases, you start introducing small industry financing, because in the 1950s and 60s, the entire corpus of funds was actually going to large business, right? In fact, Susan was showing me this work today, just an aside, just to harass people. This is more than for anything else. In the 1960s, Congress was getting 75% of the corporate funding. Susan showed me data today where even now at the height of its power, the BJP gets only 50% of its funding from these boards, 50-some percent. So, take it which way you want. But the big change is that the state is now involved in the distribution of resources. That is the big shift, much more directly than ever before. Small business, agriculture, insurance, takeover of insurance firms, then a rapid expansion of the public sector. So my famous example is, you may not believe this, but if I remember right, I may be forgetting one thing, I forget many things. In Tamil Nadu, the state of Tamil Nadu, there were 11 bus transport corporations. 11, not one, not two, 11. So that's what's going on. Appointments are being handed out on those bases. So that's what we mean by an expansion of the state. At the local level, all of a sudden, the state is now a player in terms of giving money and in terms of giving jobs, which it was not in the Nehru period in that same way. I hope that answers your question. Yes. Name, please.
Oh, sorry, I'm Elena.
Hi.
Quick question. So sort of in the wake of the 2024 presidential election, the Democrats got a lot of flack for their inability to sort of, I guess, capitalize on those underrepresented people in other cleavages. I guess if you, based on your research, have any, if you could say something to the Democratic Party about how to break out of their cleavage, do you have any thoughts on that? Big question.
I think Dan has thought because he's going to become a consultant. So.
I'm not going to become a consultant. I think that the complicated, it's overdetermined, right? Because there were a lot of people who are very, very angry about rising costs. And it wasn't really under the, what people say is that recessions hurt incumbent governments and inflation destroys them. And so there's something overdetermined about that. But the one thing to say about the way that the Democrats operate is a weird combination of high-level technocracy, like technocratic solutions, and a kind of a politics that looks at groups individually and tries to appeal to their particular points. So unlike Donald Trump, who has a much darker vision, but it's a vision that is much more expansive. I think, so that would be number one. Number two is the thing about FDR, and the thing about most of these populists is that they create institutions, like the effective ones, create new institutions, build new sort of senses of possibility. Whereas I think that the dynamic, certainly around the 2024 election, was preserving institutions, protecting institutions. And institutions are, they're both things that are very important for everything to operate, but they're also congealed power relations. And they're both simultaneously. And so, but if you forget that institutions are always going to benefit some people rather than others, then you think actually maybe this new politics of creation is a way of signaling to people that they're actually responding to problems of political inequality.
Thank you.
Thank you. Fascinating talk. You started by talking about how populism is an inherent outcome of failing democracy. And I wanted to push a bit on expanding and clarifying the mechanisms through which the state undermines democracy. A failing state undermines democracy, and perhaps going to subnational level, you briefly alluded to the case of Bihar, I assume, where it's a negative case where effectively the state does undermine democracy. Do you have at subnational level variation of positive case where the state is not able to undermine democracy, or maybe Modi's not as popular in specific?
There are
so the counter case.
Well, the counter, so we have a number, but and we have each different favorite ones. But one of my favorite ones is the DMK, the Dravida Munnetra Kazhagam, which is the in Tamil Nadu, the southern state of Tamil Nadu, that is a Dravidian nationalist political party. And what they're essentially going through is a reordering populist mobilization, in which they're essentially aggregating a whole number of people against a kind of a established elite who are, ethnically coded, actually, the sort of Brahminical elite that had dominated the Congress Party and dominated Congress Party politics in Tamil Nadu. They completely wiped the floor by the time we get to the 1960s of the Congress Party. The Congress Party has not been a player in Tamil Nadu since 1960, and partly because they had a mobilization that was responding to a large swath of the electorate. Now, Tamil Nadu is a great case of everyone, a lot of people know it as kind of a success story in terms of social provision and the politics came first, and the politics came because what they did was absolutely dramatically expand and reorient the state to ordinary people outside of this sort of privileged sort of Congress elite. And there are later iterations in which the AIA, the DMK, which is the offshoot by MGR of the DMK, is then doing an additive populist mobilization to pick up people who are not as effectively represented as we get into the 1970s, 1980s. And so as a result, Tamil Nadu, the success story of Tamil Nadu as a social provision welfare state is based on a populism that existed before, which is not usually the story that you tell, like if you read Luis's book and other things. And then there are other examples.
Name, yes, please. Hi.
Thank you. My name is Sandra. I'm a visiting fellow here at the Kellogg. Thank you for the talk. I wanted to use my question to ask you to speak briefly about the legacies, the outcomes, like maybe in theoretical terms, but also if you could give us a hint of the magical, with your powers to see into the future, of what might the long-term legacies mean both for the US and the cases that you study. It'd be fascinating. Thanks.
Given that I'm coming from Berkeley, I'm sitting on the avenue imagining, right? Just kidding. Insider joke.
Okay, so I'll deal with one or two, and then you can deal with another. So basically, when we have reordering populist politics, basically the entire political order, the electoral system, is completely overturned, right? Because the established political parties are essentially sort of squeezed down into a small proportion of the vote. You have this new political mobilization that is covering a wide array of different people that are being represented in this political party. Now, what we see out of, especially Indira Gandhi and Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, but we can see the same thing going on in lots of different cases, like, for example, AMLO and others, is that that's when two things happen. Firstly, the opposition political parties can then, because they're useless in parliament, they start becoming more like social movement-y people, like going out on the street. Some of the writings of the opposition political parties against Indira Gandhi are amazing. They're sort of like, we're going to surround her house and refuse to let her leave the house until she cedes power. It's like that kind of sort of almost insurrectionary kind of language comes because these political parties can't actually play the electoral game anymore. But then second, what happens is that there's a lot of contestation and confrontation with unelected public institutions. So if you think about like the bureaucracy, the courts are usually like front and center. And then in the end, in Pakistan, the military, right? These are people who are fundamentally challenged or sort of, afraid of this new populist mobilization. And that's how you get this sort of like dynamics of autogolpes and coups. And sometimes it works out. I mean, sometimes it actually, like Tamil Nadu is a great example, but other times it's just these kinds of confrontations. And so that's where things get kind of dangerous because there, it's basically like the electoral game is, it sort of moves into other arenas of contestation. Additive populist politics, much more complex because the opposition is still very powerful. There's usually opposition within the political party itself who are displeased with this new direction. And you have extra state institutions. So in some cases, so there's basically no, depending on the relative strength and coordination among these different actors, that can actually lead to populists consolidating power. And that's what happened with Erdogan, with Orban, with some of these other cases. Or it could lead to complete collapse of the project. So I'll give you a couple of examples. Like Boris Johnson did this amazing election based on all sorts of stuff around take back control, get Brexit done. But in the end, he's forced out of power by rebels within his own party after other stuff to do with party gates and things like that. Imran Khan becomes so unpopular that there's a vote of confidence not within his political party, but within parliament, because other political parties that had never worked together before formed together the PDM, this new coalition, which is still in power today. But it was backed up, and Susan knows this because she was there, backed up by, by the Supreme Court when Imran Khan was saying, oh, I'll just call new elections. And the Supreme Court said, no, I mean, this is a completely legally acceptable challenge. This is how the parliament works. And the military, which had previously been supporting Imran Khan, steps back and sort of says, look, this is just too chaotic. So there aren't very easy, straightforward predictions with the additive, but it's about the sort of coordination between these 3 to 4 different actors. And then of course, with when you've got polarization with the quotidian populist politics, what it tends to do is expand the sort of range of acceptable debates. That's why in Britain everyone's constantly talking about immigration now because of the Reform Party. But it's not like the Reform Party actually has voters that are voting across cleavages. It's just they're speaking loudly and then everyone is trying to respond to them. And so you get more of this kind of changes in policy discourse and language rather than actual changes in the party system in that kind of way. Does that make sense?
You have a question? Yes. Yeah, name and question. Sorry.
I'm Furkan, and I'm graduate student at the Keough Institute for International Peace Studies. So I wanted to ask, like, what's the consequences or the nature of populism and what it demands from its people? Because I'm from India, and what some kind of dramatic change I have seen in India is like the rise in the hate speeches and the rise in the mob violence and the lack of media and the personal freedom. So I just want to understand from the comparative lens, like, is it used to be the same during the Indira or the Zulfikar period, the kind of populism you're talking about? Or like, is the kind because of the new age or the new time period? What kind of similarities do you see?
There was another, I didn't answer to anybody, Dan, there was another question here, somebody else, right?
Yes, there's another.
Yes.
Yeah, my name is Kushal. I'm a grad student as well. So I kind of wanted to go back to the question about the qualitative change in the 60s and the 70s. I was just wondering that, yeah, I think the answer is very persuasive that there's more state involvement and so on and so forth. I was thinking how much of that change is to be attributed to individual figures like Indira Gandhi or Bhutto in case of Pakistan, and how much of that is maybe some kind of like a broader structural changes that are happening sort of all around. And I'm thinking of the Supreme Court, for instance, in the Indian case, right? This whole rise of public interest litigations and series of cases where the Supreme Court suddenly becomes that, they come up with this idea of epistolary jurisdiction, you write a letter and we consider it. So that, I mean, the timeline fits, it's all happening in late 60s, 70s, 80s. But how much of that, I mean, you don't necessarily see like it's not like the Supreme Court and the Indian government or Congress party are sort of hand in glove. And so I was just wondering, like, how much of that is just structural change that is happening? And then in some sense, the ground has been laid, right? Even in 50s, the Supreme Court is actively involved in cases of regulating things like prostitution or alcohol consumption. So in some sense, some of that public interest litigation work is happening in the 50s. It becomes big in the 70s and 80s.
That's a very specific question, and I will answer it. Okay, I have an answer. Anybody, because it's 5 o'clock, I'm cautious of the time. Yes, Scott, I'll take the questions. Yes, yes.
Thank you. Well, congratulations. I wanted to just go back to something that you began with, and I end up not clear where you come out. So a lot of the work on populism posits an inexorable tension between populism and democracy. And I understand that you're saying that, you know, populism is, it's not necessarily, right? It's an almost inevitable phenomenon related to political inequality under democracy. But does that mean that you disagree that there's an inexorable tension between populism and democracy? I'm not sure. So that's a really big strand in this literature.
So today, I take a strong view, just for the sake of debate. And my strong view would be yes. I think I would disagree, because I think the literature is looking at very particular cases and drawing judgments about populism from very particular cases. So what you do is you look at a really powerful case of populism. You look at Nayib Bukele, and you say, see, the whole system is going to hell in a handbasket, and therefore populists are bad for democracy. So what you're doing is you're looking, and to quote from our past lives, you're selecting in some senses on the dependent variable, because you're only looking at a handful of cases. What we are saying is that the idea of corrupt elite facing of masses is something that's much more common in democracies than we've imagined. Not all of that is bad, will necessarily be antithetical to democracy. It only becomes a problem for democracy in the extreme case when it's reordering, because then nobody else has any say. So Bukele, Chavez, right, in the Indian case, Indira Gandhi can raise all kinds of issues and just completely skew the system to work for them. In the additive case, it's a little bit more complicated, because it depends on what the opposition parties are doing. So whether populism is good or bad is somewhat, in the latter two cases, which is in the additive and the reordering, is somewhat contingent, not in the reordering. In the additive is contingent on what's happening. In the reordering, it's bad, and that's what we have in our mind. And on day-to-day populists, frankly, most people don't think of them as populists, but we think if you're going to stick to your definition of populism as elites versus masses, there's so many more cases of it than just these cases we focus on. That's a strong line.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that, I mean, it's a really good question, in part, I think, because the way everyone's focusing on populism's outcomes, right? The consequences of a populist mobilization, which then engages with all sorts of other kinds of politics that some of which can get very dangerous. But in the book, we try to make the claim that essentially populism is a symptom of democracy not working. That in fact, there's a lot of political inequality, there's a lot of people who don't feel represented by the political system. And that in some senses, symptom not a cause is a way of thinking about populism as not, oh, democracy was great, and then there was a populist who rose up, who challenged the system, and that's how democracy, like, we need to protect the democracy ex ante because that was great and this populist sucks, but rather saying actually the ex ante system had vulnerabilities in terms of the lack of failures to represent which again, just happens. That's the nature of politics, right? Everything's changing all the time. But it sort of puts populism in that context rather than juxtaposing it as one is good and the other is bad.
Well,
I know this is uncomfortable.
no, I mean, I think your answer is interesting. I don't agree that everyone who's adopted that definition of populism has done so on the basis of narrow case selection. I mean, Kurt Wieland looked at dozens of cases across 2 continents, and, you know, very illustrious political theorists who don't think so much about specific cases have also talked about an inexorable tension between populism and democracy. But let me just, if I could ask one other question. So, do you have an ex-ante measurement of crisis of representation? Or is that something that you just know occurs when a populist comes along?
We just got an answer thanks to Michael Coppage, so we can argue that.
So I should ask him.
It's productive visit.
That's productive. No, I'm done.
Well, he helped us identify measurement. And by the way, this is the same question that Victoria Murillo was also asking us at APSET last time. So we should have had more time to think about it. But basically, when you have situations where there is excessive switching of parties, when you have people who are abstaining from the vote entirely, when there is greater fragmentation. So these are just sort of warning signs, if you want. Now, I mean, obviously that's a measurement. That's a measurement of a latent concept, right? I mean, this sort of crisis representation is a latent concept. But I think that and it would be a good project for someone other than ourselves to develop a sort of a notion of like, okay, so what are the warning signs? Like, when do we see?
So I think Mainwaring et al. Argue that volatility is a very good sign. So, that's one. Yeah, right. The other one, as Scott and Michael mentioned, was in abstention. So in other words, you have regular party voters, they're no longer voting for the party. That could be another one. And the third one, as Dan pointed out, is you can look at the prior period and see if there's actually a fragmentation of the vote that's happening, that's changing. That means there is something going on, right? So those could be 3 ways of measuring it. That could be what I'll answer.
And of course, I mean, just because you have that doesn't mean necessarily an earthquake's going to happen, right? I mean, like, just the 1992 election in the US, right? Ross Perot got about 24% of the vote. And that was huge, but I mean, he didn't go anywhere. There wasn't a sort of big populist moment at that moment. So it's hard to say, okay, well, this is a necessary and sufficient condition. But as a background condition, I think you'd look for those kinds of things in the nature of the quality of the substance of representation in the party system.
Anybody else? I need to ask two very India-specific questions.
Maybe we have those folks stick around for 2 seconds afterwards to chat.
Or I can answer your question if people have. I can answer both your questions if you want. And so for you, the answer is very simple. I think, and I don't want to go into the details, but populism ends, as Adnan said, once the person wins an election. Once you're in power, you have to govern. Indira Gandhi did not. What was Indira Gandhi? Indira Gandhi completely remade the party system. So she had a whole new. Mr. Modi's party relies on a core right-wing support. And after 2014, and this is well written and well documented, I've written on this, lots of the book, we say this also, the party takes a hard rightward shift. Right, and that's pretty well established. The populism ends, as I was telling people here, lots of my Berkeley students would have voted for Modi in 2014, will not go near him in 2019. Right, because they thought this is shifted. And I mean, lots of people in India, like this urban middle class people who were voting, who thought this would be transformative, but didn't happen. So, in other words, once you're in power, the game changes. And as we point out, and I didn't do a good job of it, my apologies, that across the globe, populism is a strategy to win elections. It is not a strategy to govern. And once you have to govern, you have to govern. And that's when you face real challenges. And I think that's when the rubber meets the road. And most populists, especially if there is not enough opposition, will take an authoritarian turn. Right? That's what we would predict. Right? Even additive populists, reordering populists go authoritarian. They have to because they want every institution to succumb to them. Additive populists, whether they do it or not, depends on the strength of the other institutions. If they can weaken those institutions, they will go that way. That's the nature of power politics, right? So that's the in a nutshell the argument. And then they will rely on the darkest forces, right? Whoever supporting them the most will be actually the ones who are leading the fight. So that's the argument with the additive populists. And your question is, if you think of many of the changes, okay, if you cut to the chase, and this may sound weird, Dan and I have some minor differences on this, but it's about money. And money decisions are made by the government. The control of financial institutions passes from the private sector into the hands of the state in India and Pakistan, starting with the 70s in a much bigger way than ever before. Finance, banking, small industrial finance, all kinds of things. Right, so that's the one. As far as the court goes, the PILs come later, and now it's going to get too much into the weeds, but the Keough Bharti case was, sorry to bore everybody, but the Keough Bharti case in 1973 was actually considered a backdown by the court, because the bottom line is the Indian court had agreed India had a fundamental right to property, and the Indians wanted to take over the banking sector. The court said you can't abolish greedy persons, when India became independent, all former princes used to get money. So the government of India said, we're going to abolish it. Those guys went to court, and in a landmark judgment in 67 in Golaknath, I think they said that you actually cannot, there's a fundamental right to private property in India. Right? Then by the time you get to 1973, that idea has changed. And instead the court says that you can amend the constitution any way you want as long as it doesn't change the basic structure of the constitution. The basic structure of the constitution is something that is left open to interpretation. And whether the court interprets it and how it chooses to interpret it is a matter of debate. In the 1970s, and you may not believe this, but because I was living then, that judgment was considered to be extremely a given to Indira Gandhi. Now that same judgment was used 15 years later by the court as a means of projecting its power.
Because it gets involved in the same kind of fight, like, oh, you have political resources, we're going to take over the Ministry of Forests, because the Ministry of Forests are so expensive.
But we can discuss this offline. This is more complicated story.
With that, I will just thank our guest speaker. Thank you.